In the dark coal mines of Pennsylvania, where sweat, soot, and silence ruled, a secret brotherhood was born, not of greed, but of vengeance. Their name would echo through history as both heroes and killers, the Mollie Maguires. And at the heart of it all stood a woman who fought like a mobster, loved like a rebel, and died like a legend. Before we dive into this shadowy tale of rebellion, loyalty, and betrayal, make sure you subscribe, because what you're about to hear is one of the most explosive stories ever buried beneath America's history. The air in County Tipperary, Ireland, was thick with the smoke of burning peat and quiet despair. The year was 1845, and the famine had already begun its cruel march across the land. Fields that once shimmered with green now lay barren and black, and children with hollow eyes watched as men dug into the earth for anything they could chew. It was in this unforgiving landscape that Mollie Maguire took her first breath, a world already on fire, already hungry, already cruel. Her father was a miner, a man whose back bent under the weight of stone and sorrow, and her mother, a sharp-tongued Irishwoman with eyes that dared the world to break her spirit. They didn't have much, just a patch of land, a cabin made of rough stone, and faith so stubborn it bordered on madness. But even as a child, Mollie didn't pray for miracles. She prayed for power. The famine came like a plague, stripping Ireland bare. By the time Mollie was 10, she had seen more funerals than birthdays. The British landlords grew fat while the peasants starved, and soldiers patrolled the villages with cold, polished boots. That's where Mollie learned her first lesson. Laws were written by the powerful, and justice belonged only to those brave enough to take it. When the Maguire family boarded a ship bound for America, it wasn't hope that carried them across the Atlantic, it was rage. The voyage was long and brutal, filled with sickness and the cries of those who wouldn't survive. Mollie, barely 13, watched as the sea swallowed the dead and learned another truth. Death was patient, but it always came for the weak first. They landed in Pennsylvania, in the heart of coal country. It was a place that promised work but delivered chains. The mines stretched deep beneath the earth, swallowing men whole, their lungs filling with black dust until even breathing became an act of defiance. Irish immigrants were treated like pests, paid less, worked harder, and buried quicker. Mollie grew up surrounded by miners, tough, soot-covered men who drank hard, fought harder, and dreamed of a day when they could strike back. She listened to their whispers in taverns and church basements, stories of secret brotherhoods back in Ireland that punished cruel landlords in the dead of night. They called themselves the Ribbonmen, or the White Boys. Mollie remembered those names, and she remembered the way her father's eyes lit up when he spoke of them. By her late teens, she was already known in the community for her sharp tongue and fearless temper. When a mine boss struck a young Irishman for working too slow, Mollie was the one who stepped between them, staring the boss down until he backed away. "You hit him again," she said, "and I'll show you what Irish justice feels like." It wasn't an empty threat. That night, the man's carriage was found overturned, his windows shattered by rocks. No one knew who did it, but everyone had their suspicions. The name Mollie Maguire began as a whisper, a symbol, not a person. The men in the mines started using it like a ghost story. "Watch yourself," they'd say to an overseer who was too cruel. "Mollie Maguire's watching." Over time, that whisper grew into a movement. A name became a mask. Whether the real Mollie led it or simply inspired it, no one could ever say for certain. But in every coal town from Mahanoy to Pottsville, people believed she was the one pulling the strings, a woman who turned her pain into purpose, her anger into action. She was said to have a way with words that could turn frightened miners into soldiers. One miner described her like this: "She didn't need a gun to scare a man. She had fire in her eyes and truth in her mouth. When she spoke, you believed her, because she'd already lived everything you feared." In the evenings, when the lamps burned low and the taverns filled with smoke, Mollie would stand on a table and tell the men what no one else dared to say. "They work you like mules and call it a wage. They bury your friends in the dark and call it an accident. But every tyrant bleeds the same as you. Don't forget that." Those words spread faster than coal dust. Soon her followers began to organize, secretly at first. They met in barns and taverns, pledging loyalty under candlelight. They wore black scarves to hide their faces and carried the fury of a people who'd been denied too long. The first act of rebellion was small, a warning note left on a foreman's door. Then came a smashed cart, a broken window, and eventually, blood. Violence wasn't the plan, but once it started, it became the only language the powerful seemed to understand. Mollie didn't start the war, but she was ready to finish it. To outsiders, the Mollie Maguires were nothing more than criminals, terrorists hiding behind noble excuses. But to the miners, they were protectors, avengers, and in some strange way, heroes. They didn't fight for gold or glory. They fought for a chance to breathe, to live, to be seen as human. But Mollie knew what every fighter learns eventually, that power draws attention, and attention draws enemies. The mine owners began to notice the pattern: threats, disappearances, accidents that didn't feel accidental. They hired private detectives to infiltrate the Irish communities, men who smiled in daylight and spied in the dark. Still, in those early days, victory felt close enough to touch. The workers stood taller, spoke louder. For the first time, they saw fear in the eyes of the bosses. And behind it all was the woman who had refused to bow, the girl who had grown from famine to fury. There was one story told often around that time, that a mine official once approached Mollie at a tavern, trying to charm her into giving up the fight. He told her she was too smart, too beautiful to waste her life among miners and criminals. She laughed in his face, leaned close, and whispered, "You think I fight because I'm poor?" "No, I fight because I remember what it felt like to starve." Then she walked away, leaving him pale and shaken. Every legend begins with a spark. For Mollie, that spark came from injustice, fanned by hunger and ignited by rage. She didn't know it yet, but the fire she started would soon consume the entire coal region, and her name would become both a rallying cry and a curse. As the sun set over the black hills of Pennsylvania, smoke rising from the chimneys and the faint hum of drills echoing underground, a storm was brewing. The people at the bottom of the earth were ready to rise. And at the center of it all stood Mollie Maguire, the Irish rebel who would fight like a mobster and change the course of history, one act of defiance at a time. The coal mines of Pennsylvania were more like catacombs than workplaces. Endless tunnels carved into the earth, damp and choking, lit only by flickering lamps that made shadows dance on the rock. Down there, a man could work 10 hours and still owe money by the end of the week. The bosses called it the company system. Mollie called it slavery with paperwork. By now, she was in her early 20s, hard-edged, fearless, and unafraid to get her hands dirty. Her Irish accent had softened, but her temper hadn't. Every morning, she watched the miners march into the black mouth of the mines like soldiers going to war. And every evening she saw them stumble back out, coughing blood into their handkerchiefs. The air itself was poison, filled with coal dust so thick you could taste it. Men grew old before they hit 40, and the company still found ways to squeeze them dry. Wages were cut, rents were raised, and the scrip, company-issued currency, kept the miners trapped. You could only spend it at the company store, where prices were double what they should be. It was a perfect circle of control. The miners dug the coal, the bosses took the money, and the workers were buried under both. Mollie began to organize the anger she saw boiling in the taverns and shanty towns. Her gatherings were small at first, just a handful of men huddled in the back of O'Malley's pub after dark. They spoke in whispers, always checking the door for fear of informants. The Pinkerton detectives were already prowling the area, blending in, pretending to be miners, while reporting every suspicious word to the coal companies. Still, the movement grew. Word spread that Mollie could rally even the most broken man with her speeches. She didn't preach hope, she promised payback. She reminded the miners that they built the empire beneath their feet, and that the bosses feared them more than they knew. "They think we're dogs," she said one night, standing on a bar table with a glass of whiskey in her hand. "But even dogs bite when they're kicked too long." That speech lit a fire that wouldn't go out. The Mollie Maguires began to form in secret, an underground brotherhood bound by blood oaths and vengeance. Their roots reached back to Ireland, to the secret societies that fought landlords and soldiers with pitchforks and courage. But in America, their tools were sharper. Guns, dynamite, and the cover of the dark Pennsylvania night. Mollie became their voice, their strategist, their whisper in the dark. Some said she never held a weapon herself, that her power came from her words. Others swore she planned every attack, every warning letter, every act of sabotage that shook the mines. The truth, like all legends, lies somewhere between the two. The first real strike of the Mollies came after a miner named Seamus O'Donnell was beaten nearly to death for demanding safer working conditions. The mine boss called it discipline. Mollie called it war. Within a week, the boss's stables burned to the ground, his prized horses gone with the smoke. A note pinned to his front door read, "Courtesy of Mollie Maguire." We remember Seamus. After that, the name spread like wildfire. To the workers, it was justice. To the coal barons, it was terrorism. Mollie had become a ghost. No one could prove she existed, but everyone knew she did. Her legend moved faster than the truth, and in time, even she began to realize the power of that myth. She would walk through the mining towns and hear her own name whispered like a prayer. "Mollie's watching," they'd say when a boss pushed too far. The fear she inspired was worth more than any bullet. Even the company guards grew nervous when the wind howled through the mine shafts at night. But power like that doesn't go unnoticed. Soon the coal companies began to fight back. They brought in strikebreakers, hired armed guards, and planted informants among the Irish workers. Anyone caught attending meetings could be blacklisted, or worse. The prisons began to fill with men accused of being Mollies, many with no proof beyond rumor. Still, Mollie didn't stop. She believed the movement was bigger than her, that the miners deserved to stand up, even if it meant dying for it. Her closest allies begged her to lay low, to stop making speeches, but she refused. "If they hang me for speaking," she said, "then my silence would have killed me long before the rope." As tensions rose, violence became unavoidable. Mines exploded mysteriously. Foremen vanished on their way home. Notes signed with the infamous name appeared on doors, in newspapers, even nailed to church doors. To the outside world, it looked like chaos. To the miners, it looked like balance. There was one night, remembered long after, when Mollie stood on a hill overlooking the town of Shenandoah. Below her, the furnaces glowed red, painting the sky like a wound. She turned to the man beside her, an old miner named Patrick Hanlon, and said quietly, "They'll call us monsters before they ever call us heroes. But the earth knows the truth." Patrick didn't understand at first, but later, after everything fell apart, he would. By 1870, the coal region had become a powder keg. Strikes erupted almost weekly, and the Mollies were blamed for every gunshot, every explosion, every accident. Mollie herself was said to have disappeared, moving from town to town, always one step ahead of the law. Some claimed she lived among the miners in disguise. Others swore she'd gone back to Ireland. The truth was simpler. She was still there, hiding in plain sight, watching the war she'd started take on a life of its own. Even those who doubted her existence began to believe. The name had become unstoppable, untouchable, a symbol of rebellion carved deep into the bones of the coal country. It was no longer about one woman or even one group. It was about every miner who refused to die quietly in the dark. Yet Mollie knew what was coming. She'd seen it before in Ireland, how power hunts down rebellion, how the rich never forgive the poor for fighting back. The Pinkertons were tightening their grip, digging deeper into the mines than any shovel ever could. The government had joined the fight now, branding the Mollies as anarchists and traitors. And the hangman's noose, which had been waiting in the shadows all along, was beginning to stir. Still, she didn't regret it. As she wrote in a letter to an old friend in Ireland, "They think we fight for coal, but we fight for breath, for bread, for the right to walk in sunlight without bending our backs to men who never touch the dirt." In those words, you could hear both the pride and the tragedy of Mollie Maguire. She had built something powerful but fragile, a rebellion made of miners and whispers, of hope and hate intertwined. And even as the walls closed in, she stood firm, a rebel carved from stone. Soon the pits would no longer just swallow coal, they would swallow lives. Betrayal was on the horizon, carried by those who once stood beside her. And when it came, it would shatter everything she fought to build. For now, though, the fires of rebellion still burned bright beneath the ground, and the people still whispered her name in the dark. Half in fear, half in faith, Mollie Maguire had found her cause. But the world above was getting ready to crush it. By the early 1870s, the Mollie Maguires had become the most feared secret organization in all of Pennsylvania. To some, they were ghosts in the night. To others, angels of justice. But to the coal barons and railroad magnates, they were something worse. a rebellion they couldn't see, couldn't control, and couldn't destroy. The movement had grown far beyond the mining towns of Schuylkill County. In taverns, boarding houses, and dark church basements, miners swore blood oaths to protect one another and punish the cruel. They met in silence, spoke in code, and carried the same fury that Mollie had once ignited with nothing more than her words. If a mine boss cut wages or beat a worker, a note would appear on his door. By order of the Mollie Maguires, cease your cruelty or face our justice. Sometimes the note was the only warning. Sometimes it was followed by a bullet. The coal fields became a battlefield without uniforms. Strikes erupted. Fires burned in the dead of night. Horses were found dead. Shafts were sabotaged, and overseers were ambushed on lonely roads. The Mollies didn't strike for greed. They struck for survival. And every act of violence was both message and revenge. The newspapers began calling it the Reign of Terror. The Irish, they said, were lawless, ungrateful, dangerous. But in the taverns, among the miners' families, the name Mollie Maguire was spoken like a prayer for the oppressed. She had become a symbol now, a myth so powerful that no one could tell where the woman ended and the legend began. Still, Mollie herself remained in the shadows. Some said she led the brotherhood from afar, using coded letters and secret couriers. Others swore she had vanished long ago, and the men just used her name to keep the spirit alive. Whatever the truth, her influence was everywhere. The coal companies, desperate and terrified, decided to fight back with something even darker. They hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency, men known for their ruthlessness, their precision, and their ability to infiltrate and destroy from within. And leading this effort was a man named James McParland. McParland was an Irishman himself, which made him the perfect spy. He shaved his mustache, changed his name to James McKenna, and moved into the mining towns like a man looking for honest work. No one suspected him. He drank in the same taverns, worked beside the miners, even joined their secret meetings. Within months, he was one of them, or so they thought. Mollie, ever cautious, distrusted new faces. She was said to have tested McParland once by sending him a false message about a planned strike. When no trouble followed, she warned her closest allies, "There's a fox among us." But by then, it was too late. The Pinkertons had already gathered names, dates, and secrets that would soon doom the brotherhood. Meanwhile, the Mollies grew bolder. They began targeting more than just foremen and bosses. They went after politicians, sheriffs, and even priests who sided with the companies. Entire towns whispered that you could feel the Mollies watching from the shadows. There was a story from those years, one the miners loved to tell in hushed tones. A cruel overseer named Patrick Devlin had beaten a man half to death for being late. The next morning, Devlin's house was found empty, the door swinging open. His boots sat by the fire, but Devlin himself was gone. Some said he fled the state. Others swore they saw his body floating down the Schuylkill River days later. Either way, no one ever beat another miner in that town again. For every act like that, though, the noose of law tightened. The Pinkertons filed reports, gathered witnesses, and built cases in secret. They painted the Mollies as a criminal empire, an Irish mafia in the mines. Judges were bribed, juries were bought, and newspapers printed stories that made the Irish out to be villains in their own tragedy. And yet, for all the chaos, Mollie's influence only grew. She had become the ghost of Irish justice, the face of rebellion painted in smoke and fear. Even children whispered her name at night, daring each other to say it 3 times in the dark. But power built on fear is never stable. The brotherhood began to splinter. Some wanted to push harder, more strikes, more blood. Others began to doubt, questioning whether they were fighting for justice or revenge. Mollie herself, weary from years of struggle, started to see the cracks forming. There's an old story that she once confessed to a priest under false name, asking, "If justice is taken by the poor, does it still count as sin?" The priest didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't. The miners, though, still believed. When McParland's reports reached the company heads, they finally decided to act. Warrants were drawn, arrests planned. But before that day came, one more act of violence would light the final match. In the spring of 1875, a mine boss named Benjamin Yost was shot outside his home after turning off the street lamps that guided the miners' paths home. Witnesses claimed to see shadows running through the night and the words, Mollie sends her regards carved into the dirt near his doorstep. It was the spark the authorities had been waiting for. Within days, raids swept through the coal towns. Dozens of Irish miners were arrested, some guilty, most not. The trials that followed were a spectacle. The courtrooms overflowed with reporters and company men, while Pinkerton detectives testified behind polished words. McParland himself appeared as the star witness, revealing the names of men he'd shared bread and beer with for years. The betrayal was total. The accused stood silent, proud, and doomed. Many claimed they had never even met a woman named Mollie Maguire. But it didn't matter. The legend was too large now. It had to be destroyed. The prosecutors called the Mollies the poison of America's veins. The defense called them the voice of the working man. History would decide which one was true. In the crowd, they said a woman in black attended every trial. She never spoke, never cried. Some swore it was Mollie herself, watching as her creation was dismantled piece by piece. Others said it was just a grieving widow. The truth, like her name, had become a ghost story. The sentences were brutal. 20 men were condemned to hang. The newspapers called it justice. The miners called it murder. And through it all, Mollie's name echoed through the towns like thunder over the mountains, unseen, unforgotten, unrepentant. By the end of 1875, the brotherhood was shattered. Fear still lingered, but the power had shifted back to the companies. The rebellion that once rose from the pits was now being buried in them, and yet, even in defeat, the Mollies had changed something permanent. They had proven that the working poor could fight back, that the coalfields weren't just graves for the forgotten, but battlegrounds for dignity. As for Mollie Maguire, her fate remained a mystery. Some say she fled to New York, living under a false name. Others claim she was among those quietly executed, her identity erased to protect the legend. But the truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the story, the fire she lit that refused to die. In every mine, every strike that came after, you could still hear her whisper in the dark. They can bury the body, but not the cause. The summer of 1876 came heavy with the smell of coal dust and fear. The rebellion that once burned bright in the hearts of the miners now flickered like a dying lamp. The Mollie Maguires, those ghosts who had once ruled the shadows, were cornered, hunted, and betrayed from within. The name that had terrified coal barons for a decade was about to be used as the justification for mass execution. It began quietly. Pinkerton men moved through the towns like vultures, handing out warrants signed in ink that might as well have been blood. Families were torn apart in the night, fathers dragged from beds, sons handcuffed before their mothers, wives screaming as they were forced to watch. The law didn't come with honor or warning. It came with rifles and fear. Mollie watched from the edges of it all, hidden behind the anonymity that her legend had given her. She had become the story now, her name a shield and a curse. Some of the men being dragged away had never met her, but still they cried, "Long live Mollie Maguire," as they were forced into wagons bound for Pottsville and Mauch Chunk, where the trials awaited. The company towns rejoiced. The newspapers called it the cleansing of the coal fields. But to the miners and their families, it was a slaughter disguised as justice. The trials were a circus. Judge after judge paraded Irish names through the courtroom, reading charges filled with half-truths and fear-mongering. Evidence came from the same Pinkerton spies who had infiltrated the Brotherhood, none more infamous than James McParland, the man who'd once shared their bread and drink, who now stood before them polished and proud, reading from his notes as if he were describing strangers. The miners stared at him like they were watching Judas himself. One of them, a man named Alexander Campbell, shouted from his cell, "You'll hang us for being Irish, not for being guilty." The guards struck him down, but his words echoed down the hallways of the courthouse and into the pages of history. Mollie's allies began to vanish, some imprisoned, some dead, some turning on each other to save their own necks. The brotherhood that once operated like a single heart had fractured into frightened, desperate pieces. Betrayal spread faster than the Pinkertons ever could, and still, the executions drew closer. They called it the Day of the Rope. June 21st, 1877, one of the darkest days in Pennsylvania's history. 10 men were hanged across 2 towns, their necks snapping like the ties that once bound them together. Crowds gathered to watch. Newspapers sold extra editions. The mine owners smiled in their mansions, drinking whiskey while the rebels swung. But before his death, Alexander Campbell made a final stand. He pressed his hand against the wall of his cell and declared, "There's my mark. May it remain forever to prove my innocence." The handprint stayed there for decades, refusing to fade. Some say it's still visible even now, a ghostly reminder that the truth cannot be buried so easily. Mollie, they said, watched from afar that day, her face hidden beneath a black veil. Some believed she stood among the crowd. Others swore she knelt in a church miles away, praying for the souls of the dead. Wherever she was, that day marked the end of the rebellion she had started. The world above celebrated the hangings as a victory for law and order. But deep underground in the black veins of the mines, the truth felt different. Men worked in silence that week, their picks striking the earth in slow, heavy rhythm. The coal they dug seemed darker, as if stained with the memory of those who had died for it. Still, Mollie couldn't rest. Guilt gnawed at her like a starving rat. She had wanted justice, not this. She had wanted dignity for her people, not martyrdom. And yet she couldn't bring herself to regret the fight. "If not us," she whispered one night, sitting by a fire with an old friend, "then who?" Her companion, an aging miner missing 2 fingers from a cave-in, looked at her sadly. "You gave them courage, Mollie. But courage costs too much in this world." She didn't reply. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, sounding too much like gunfire in her ears. The authorities weren't finished. More trials followed, more hangings, more names etched into the long list of the dead. The newspapers kept printing the same headline: "Justice served, the Mollie Maguires destroyed." But justice, Mollie knew, was the last thing being served. It was fear, neatly wrapped and sold to the public. By 1878, the movement had been crushed. The Pinkertons had declared victory. The coal companies had restored their grip. And the last of the brotherhood had gone underground, some hiding in the mountains, others fleeing west where no one asked questions. But the spirit of rebellion refused to die completely. In some mining towns, candles were still lit on the anniversary of the hangings. Families whispered prayers for the men who had swung, and the name Mollie Maguire was still spoken in reverence. Children grew up hearing stories of the brave woman who fought like a man, who defied kings and coal barons alike. But the government saw her differently. To them, she was the face of lawlessness, a woman who had inspired terror under the guise of justice. There were whispers that she had been captured in secret, tried without a name, and quietly executed. Others said she escaped to Canada under a false identity. The truth has never been found. Some claim she died an old woman in hiding, still carrying the coal dust of Pennsylvania under her fingernails. Others insist she was buried in an unmarked grave alongside the very men she led into battle. But perhaps in a way, she never died at all. Legends don't need bodies. They live on in stories, in warnings, in the silence that follows injustice. The coal companies may have destroyed the brotherhood, but they couldn't destroy the memory. Every miner who stood up for fair wages, every strike that followed in the years to come, carried a trace of Mollie's defiance. And even McParland, the man who betrayed them, was haunted by what he'd done. Years later, he would admit to friends that the executions never sat right with him, that maybe the Pinkertons had gone too far. He died rich, yes, but restless. Perhaps somewhere deep down, he understood that you can't bury the truth forever, not even beneath a mountain of coal. The final image of that chapter in history was not of the hangman's rope, nor of the smirking mine owners who watched their enemies die. It was of the miners, those same men who had once whispered Mollie's name in the dark, walking back into the pits the next morning, heads low but hearts still beating. They had lost the battle but not the war for dignity, and in that quiet march back into the depths, you could almost hear her voice, low, fierce, and unbroken, carried through the tunnels like a ghost. "They can chain our bodies, but they'll never chain our souls." The world moved on. The coal kept burning, and history tried to forget. But legends like Mollie Maguire don't fade. They wait, hidden, patient, until the next time the poor rise up and the powerful tremble. When the morning came, the air in Pottsville felt heavy, like the earth itself mourned. The townsfolk gathered in silence outside the old prison, their eyes cast toward the scaffold rising against the pale dawn. Mollie Maguire stood tall as the hangman adjusted the rope, her chin lifted like a queen before her court. She didn't plead. She didn't weep. She stared into the crowd, her eyes burning with the same fury that had once set the coal fields aflame. In that moment, she wasn't just a miner's daughter, nor a rebel leader. She was something larger, an idea that no noose could choke. The executioner asked if she had any last words. Mollie's voice, hoarse but unbroken, carried through the courtyard. "You can hang a body," she said, "but you can't hang the truth." And with that, the trapdoor fell. The crowd gasped, but a strange stillness followed. It wasn't victory anyone felt that day. It was unease, because deep down, they knew the story wasn't over. The Mollie Maguires had been condemned. But what they stood for, justice in a world rigged against them, still clawed at the conscience of every man who had ever swung a pickaxe or watched a loved one starve. In the months that followed, the mines grew quieter, but not because peace had returned. Fear had. Men spoke in whispers, glancing over their shoulders before uttering the name Mollie. Some said they saw her ghost wandering the mine entrances at dusk, her lantern glowing faintly in the fog. Others claimed her spirit haunted the coal baron's dreams, whispering the names of the damned. The authorities tried to erase her. Newspapers branded her a terrorist. Preachers called her soul lost. Even some of her old allies distanced themselves, desperate to avoid the gallows. But legends have a way of surviving in the cracks, passed down through song, through story, through the quiet fury of the working class. Mothers told their children, "Remember Mollie Maguire. She fought for what was right, even when the world called her wrong." Years later, when the dust of industry settled and historians came digging for the truth, they found more than just records. They found a rebellion that refused to be buried. Letters, testimonies, and folk songs painted a portrait not of monsters, but of desperate people cornered by injustice. And at the center of it all stood Mollie, a woman who led men in a world that told her to kneel. Her name began to change shape. For some, she remained the face of a violent secret society, a mob that ruled the mines through fear. For others, she became a folk hero, the embodiment of resistance against an empire of greed. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. But one thing was certain, her story wouldn't die quietly. By the early 1900s, the coal industry began to crumble under its own weight. Strikes erupted, unions rose, and workers learned to organize not with fists in the dark, but with voices in the daylight. Yet even those union leaders, decades later, admitted that without the fearlessness of the Mollies, no one would have dared stand up in the first place. Mollie Maguire had lit a match that burned long after her death. Her legacy drifted far beyond the coal towns of Pennsylvania. In Ireland, where the name Mollie Maguire had once belonged to peasant women who resisted landlords, her American story became a symbol of how far the Irish spirit of defiance had traveled. In ballads and whispers, she became something immortal, a ghost, a martyr, a warning. Even today, historians argue over whether the Mollies were criminals or freedom fighters. Some point to the murders and sabotage, others to the brutal exploitation that gave them no other choice. But when you strip away the headlines and propaganda, what remains is a simple truth. Mollie Maguire and her people were trapped in a system designed to break them, and they chose to fight back. Right or wrong, that choice defined them. In the dim corridors of old mining towns, places long abandoned, you can still see faded carvings on the stone walls, initials, dates, sometimes even her name. A silent rebellion etched into the earth itself, and if you listen close, you might imagine the echo of pickaxes striking rhythmically against the rock, a heartbeat for the forgotten. There's something almost poetic about how her story lingers. The coal that once fueled America's rise was born of pressure and darkness. So too was Mollie Maguire. She came from the depths, carrying the rage and resilience of a people who refused to vanish quietly. And though her name has been twisted and used by both sides of history, the fire behind it never went out. Somewhere in the quiet hills of Pennsylvania, the old mines sleep. The company houses rot, the rail lines rust, and the voices of the dead settle into the wind. But if you walk there at dusk, when the light fades and the air smells of earth and iron, you might still feel her presence. Not as a ghost of fear, but as a memory of resistance. Because the truth is, Mollie Maguire never really needed saving. She wasn't the kind to ask for mercy. She was the kind who demanded reckoning. And though they hung her body, they couldn't hang her message. She fought like a mobster, thought like a revolutionary, and died like a martyr. Every rebellion has a cost, and hers was paid in full. But the power she awakened, the idea that ordinary people could stand against tyranny, remains as alive today as it was in the dark of those coal tunnels. Her story reminds us that the line between villain and hero is drawn not by history, but by who holds the pen. So when you hear the name Mollie Maguire, don't just think of violence or vengeance. Think of the woman who refused to bow, the one who faced the gallows with fire in her eyes and truth on her tongue, the one who showed the world that even in the blackest depths, a single spark can start a revolution. And as the credits of history roll, her legacy stands, untamed, unburied, unforgettable.